Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. As China's military capabilities expand, U.S.-China frictions intensify, and regional tensions increase, concern is on the rise that a potential crisis, either accidental or deliberate, could take place that could spiral out of control. If a crisis arises with China, leaders may want to de-escalate and prevent a wider conflict. To do so, they will need to understand how China thinks about crisis management and escalation. My guest today has dug into the writings of PLA strategists and authoritative Chinese sources, as well as Western scholarship, to assess how China views military escalation and how the United States and other countries can accurately predict and interpret PRC signaling in crisis scenarios. Lyle Morris, my guest today, is a senior fellow on foreign policy and national security at the Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society Policy Institute. And his recently published paper is titled China's Views on Escalation and Crisis Management and Implications for the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast, Lyle.
Thanks for having me on.
So I want to ask you first just a little bit about your methodology in doing this research. What are the authoritative sources that you rely on to understand China's concept of what you refer to as war control and escalation dynamics? I know you cite the science of military strategy, and all of the China watchers rely very heavily on that volume. But of course, it's now the latest one, 12 years old. So how can we be certain that it reflects current Chinese thinking today? And are there other more recent authoritative sources?
Well, thanks for the question, Bonnie, and thanks for having me on the podcast. I've been an avid listener and watcher for many years, so it's an honor to be on the podcast. So to answer your question, I wrote about this concept of effective control. It's long been present in authoritative PLA doctrinal writings for several decades now. You mentioned the science of military strategy, so it was in the 2013 and 2020 editions, for example. But I think more importantly, at a political level, it is used by Xi Jinping in his 19th Party Congress Work Report in 2017. So I think for Xi to kind of elevate the doctrine in a major party speech, to me, suggests that it's been, vetted and approved by Xi himself, which I think, should be taken seriously. But you do bring up a good point about sources, and it's one of my concerns, quite frankly, that in the PLA watching community, we increasingly don't have access to official current sources on PLA thinking on crisis management and control. Most of it's being published internally in China. My worry, quite frankly, is we have a blind spot in PLA studies by not having access to, recent doctrinal publications, which is something I try to raise in this report and also what I try to raise when I meet with my Chinese counterparts. My operating principle is I think it puts both the China and the U.S. at a disadvantage. It creates an atmosphere where, we mirror image theories and actions onto the other without truly knowing how the other side will react in a conflict. So that's why, open source resources like I used in this paper are so important, and the importance of, translating and analyzing PLA journal articles, for example, is so important.
So let's dig into some of the meat of this paper that you've written. China's invested considerable intellectual capital developing theories and strategies for managing escalation with potential adversaries. Talk a bit about what the theories and the concepts are that they've developed, and I'm curious whether they have any roots in Western thinking about managing escalation.
Yeah, so what inspired me to write this report was really a curiosity over how China would deal with a crisis with the United States or other regional actors, and what theoretical concepts would inform the PLA during a crisis, especially as we know China has not fought a war in over 45 years. So, thanks to a growing academic research on Chinese security policy, I think we now know more about how China conceptually approaches and thinks about deterrence and crisis management than we did before. So, in this paper, I analyzed China's concept of effective control, or what they call 有效控制, to understand how China thinks about crisis. If I were to summarize this effective control concept, it's basically a flexible, kind of graduated tool designed to guide political and military action during times of heightened tension. This Chinese doctrine, I believe, represents one of many conceptual frameworks for operationalizing the Chinese theory of deterrence and how China might adjust or change its strategy as a crisis evolves from peacetime to confrontation and war.
So one of the points that you make in the paper, and I'll quote you here, uh, is China believes it can control all facets of military escalation, and this could make China's leaders overconfident in their ability to prevail in a conflict and thus increase the risk of escalation in a military confrontation between China and the United States. So, can you provide some examples that demonstrate that the PLA believes that it can control all facets of military escalation, that really underscores and proves their level of confidence?
Yeah, so the concept of effective control really rests on this theoretical assumption that if a crisis breaks out, that it could be, scientifically controlled, is the word they use, and that if escalation or if a crisis breaks out, that escalation could be managed, and they have all these scientific principles, and they also have advanced military technology that they use. So it seems like they've developed this concept to, reduce the risks of a crisis and war, reduce the damage of warfare, limit escalation, and then terminate war on terms favorable to China. But its focus, first of all, is really on preventing crisis from occurring, and about how China would effectively manage a crisis to maximize its interests. But one of the key takeaways, as you pointed out, about this concept is I think China, at least based on this theory that I read, they do make some pretty bold and, I would argue, inaccurate assumptions that may not match reality. They believe that China can exert, control over all facets of escalation, control the dynamics of war, and account for, all the variables using scientific principles of deterrence. So this theory of escalation, I think, implies a high degree of confidence in China's ability to manage escalation during times of crisis. And that was one of my main findings, and one that frankly concerned me when it comes to U.S.-China crisis management. This theory takes little account of what we in the West describe as the fog of war. So to me, it seems to rely significantly on game theory and algorithms that PLA leadership and scholars have analyzed for decades, and they truly believe they can predict foreign policy behavior, and based on those predictions and that behavior, they can adjust their strategy to succeed in a crisis, and also do so in ways that limits escalation. So, to me, it's a product of China's kind of dialectical analysis and theory of action and reaction, where they've elevated it to a science. And I've read, a lot of these journal articles where there's actual formulas that PLA has developed for variables such as, adversary intent, targeting, will to fight. But frankly, I'm skeptical that China or any country can kind of, math their way out of the very unpredictable dynamics of war. But as far as contingencies, you asked about, examples. I think the ongoing disputes in the South China Sea offer an example of this theory in practice, whereby, China very selectively pushes regional claimants through its Coast Guard and maritime militia, asserting its claims while being, very cognizant and mindful not to allow coercion to spill over into conflict. So, in other words, I think they've been, fairly effective at managing escalation with regional states in the South China Sea, while achieving their kind of limited objectives of asserting what they believe to be their maritime rights within its nine dash line. I would also say that, when it comes to other conflicts, the 1969 conflict between the Soviet Union and China is another good example where, China moved arguably to there's a four phases in this concept of the third phase, curb the war. So they, initiated an attack on Soviet troops on Jenba Island, but they did so, I would argue, ensuring that the use of force did not escalate into a full-scale war.
One of the aspects of Chinese thinking about war that we often see in their writings is that they have to have the ability to seize the initiative early in a conflict and maintain the initiative throughout the conflict. So, can you talk about how that informs China's approach to escalation and crisis management? And does China's desire to seize the initiative run counter to its desire to limit escalation, which you argue they really do want to ultimately limit escalation and they don't seek war, which I think is also an important point. Not that they wouldn't go to war if they have to, but that isn't their first thing, that they would rather limit escalation. And I mean, to quote, Sun Tzu would, to win without fighting.
Right. So there's four kind of stages of this effective control concept. And just really quickly, I'll name them just so the audience is aware. So the first is called effectively shape the situation. The second, control the crisis. The third, curb the war. And fourth, win the war. So the first two concepts emphasize the need to, manage escalation and prevent it from moving into conflict. And then the last two phases are when those attempts have failed, so they move into the war phase and the kinetic phase. So the first component, kind of to your question about effectively shaping the situation, like what does that mean? So for the PLA, it includes, comprehensive planning, preparing itself for a conflict, using both military and non-military tools, to establish advantageous strategic conditions conducive to internal and external stability. And then on the foreign policy front, its role in this phase is to create a perception, if possible, and a conclusion in global and domestic public opinion on where the blame lies. So they're very much in this kind of blaming narrative phase where they're trying to assert their legitimate interest in the conflict and, persuade an international audience that whatever China is doing is legitimate and protecting its interests. So during this first phase, there's a lot of information operations, shaping public opinion both in China and internationally. But then when it goes into the second phase about the controlling the crisis stage, this is where it gets a little dicey when it comes to signaling and U.S.-China deterrence signaling, because a lot of the things that China does during this phase is trying to show resolve and use kind of non-kinetic means such as space and cyber operations to start to create the conditions for succeeding in the conflict. But that's when the potential for escalation is increases. So they do during this phase, they'll do a lot of military exercises, pre-positioning of mobile assets, surveillance, reconnaissance. But I mentioned the cyber element of it. So they will conduct very robust cyber operations during this phase. And as we know, the U.S. has signaled that it will not regard such operations as peaceful, as de-escalatory. It's going to be quite the opposite, actually. So this is where we get into misreading of signals between the U.S. and China, and whatever China's goals are. Usually, it seems to be, my interpretation is it's going to be interpreted in Washington, D.C. as the opposite, which is very escalatory. And then finally, just you mentioned about this concept of momentum, and this was prevalent in the Chinese writings. They use this word "sure" or momentum. It seems to be pretty vital to this phase. So they truly believe that, like, if they develop kind of positive, um, uh, you know, momentum and actions that can show the adversary that they are going to not be successful in pushing back against China's claims. It's part of their dialectic kind of principles of using, both momentum and then de-escalatory variables to push the adversary to stop whatever they're doing. But the intent here is to prevent the crisis from kind of metastasizing into conflict, but also showcasing China's resolve, and by maintaining an active deterrence posture, with the objective of emerging from any conflict, having secured Chinese national interests.
Well, there's obviously some contradictions in some of the way that the Chinese think about fighting. As some of these things that you talk about, of course, China's quite comfortable with contradictions. It's an integral part of the way their ideology and their approach to many things. But I want to highlight one in particular, and maybe ask you to explain it a bit. So you argue the PLA views crises as something that have to be controlled, that they have to avoid jeopardizing the nation's development in the period of strategic opportunity. And this, of course, is something that goes back to Jiang Zemin talking about the period of strategic opportunity. And Xi Jinping has set 2049 as the period in which, right, the year and in which China will need to achieve national rejuvenation. So that's the goal of strategic opportunity, is to ultimately achieve national rejuvenation. So that suggests to me that in some ways China's averse to using force until a crisis goes kinetic, but then aren't there instances in which China might conclude that it must use force first? So, for example, against Taiwan, where you could distinguish between a war of necessity and a war of choice. And in a war of necessity, China actually might decide, yes, we have to, our legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party is being threatened, or even in a war of choice scenario where they've given up on all peaceful means, including coercion opposite Taiwan, and decide that they do have to use force. So how do you resolve these sort of, or think about these contradictions?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because, while this concept is very defensive in nature, there's a very clear kind of breaking point where China's decided that its efforts have been unsuccessful of managing escalation, and that's where you get into this curbing the war and winning the war phase. So, I think I wouldn't suggest that this concept means that China is completely risk averse. I think, kind of as you alluded to, I think they're quite risk acceptant once they believe they have to fight, and once they believe they have to emerge from a military crisis successfully. And this is again where I think there's a tension between the means that China views as controlling escalation, within the range, as well as the range of kind of less controllable factors that could lead to unintentional escalation on the battlefield. So this is where, intended acts of deterrence, as conceived by China, could in fact be misinterpreted as an opening salvo of an outright war with the United States. So, for example, PLA analysts argue in favor of precision air and space strikes at a conflict's outset to deter an enemy from continuing the fight. They believe crippling an adversary's cyber capabilities and electromagnetic interference against space and network systems would provide escalation dominance. In reality, the U.S. is likely to interpret such actions radically different, and this is where we enter kind of a more dangerous phase where, signals will definitely be misread and misinterpreted on both sides. So I think the point is when a crisis moves to a kinetic phase, China is usually all in and will use force to compel the opponent to cease activity. But that's where the Chinese theory, I think, starts to break down a little bit because they're arguing on one hand, all means to limit escalation. On the other hand, they're arguing very escalatory actions early in a conflict to, deter the enemy from continuing their actions. So there's definitely a tension in the theoretical aspects of China's this effective control concept with the practical aspects of escalation, especially how it will be read in the United States.
The U.S. and China, you write, have different approaches to crisis management and response. And one of the things that you highlight is that PLA writings omit consideration of how China's actions may be perceived or misperceived by an adversary. So you state the potential for an adversary to view Chinese actions early in a conflict as provocative grounds for, counter escalatory responses is absent from Chinese writings, and that this mismatch could be the basis for unintended escalation between the U.S. and China. And that got me to think about what the U.S. approach is. Does the United States actively consider how its actions may be perceived or misperceived by an adversary? Is this a problem on both sides, or is it really primarily on the Chinese side? And then have you thought about what could be done to lower the risk of escalation as a result of this lack of attention to how the other side, the adversary, perceives or misperceives one's actions?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but based on my time at DoD and kind of interacting with Chinese, you know, counterparts and military counterparts, I think all the ingredients are present between our two countries for unintended escalation. And we both do a lot of work on red teaming both sides and kind of understanding what the adversary will do and how they think. But the bottom line is our policies are very much geared towards out escalating each other and not de-escalation. So I think the conditions are ripe for unintended escalation. As far as policies to mitigate this, a lot of people have advocated for crisis communication hotlines between the two countries, and I wrote a commentary in 2022, and I guess it was slightly, I don't know, it's like controversial, but it kind of, my point and my argument in the piece was that we don't need more crisis communication hotlines between the two nations. We have plenty, at different levels at DoD and NSC and executive branch, because we U.S. and China have fundamentally different interpretations and values about a crisis hotline, about a mil hotline. So I think adding another hotline would give false hope that the United States and the PRC would resolve disputes more rapidly. The bottom line is China doesn't have the same value and goals for hotlines that the United States does. So, they very much look at hotlines within a broader kind of political goal of crisis management. I think they use them not to resolve the crisis, but to empower higher level organs in the PLA to signal resolve. Assign blame, stall, for example. So I don't think another crisis hotline is what's needed. I think on the U.S. side, we have a very large bureaucracy of national security entities, and sometimes that bureaucracy does not do a very good job of coordinating. So I think we need to focus internally in the U.S. on, if a crisis were to emerge, who's going to talk, what are some actions that we have off the table that we can employ very quickly in a crisis and not wait for our Chinese counterparts to pick up the phone, as we know they usually don't during the first few days of a crisis. So I think more internal kind of bureaucratic coordination would help our own bureaucracy to respond quickly. I also think that China is very good at signaling what it calls its core interests and red lines to the U.S. For example, over Taiwan, South China Sea, we know well what those core interests are, and they're very good at saying, basically, if the U.S. does X, Y, and Z, China will respond, very strongly. I think because of how U.S. interests are scoped, I think it's sometimes hard to delineate clearly what our core interests are. We don't use the word core interest, but we use national interests. I think, or vital, exactly. So, when we meet with Chinese interlocutors, one thing that concerns me is that because we have such a broader set, that we, the U.S., have such a broader set of interests, that China's a little bit unclear about things that we would do or not do in response to what they would do. So, I'm a big believer of being, very firm with what actions China would do that would necessitate a U.S. response. Uh, not to say red lines, but just certain scenarios like space and cyber, because China clearly believes that they're going to act, very aggressively in space and cyber, and presumably not warrant a strong U.S. response. So the more that we can signal to China that these will be regarded as very escalatory actions and necessitating a U.S. response, the better. Um, I also think just understanding Chinese concepts. That's why I wrote this paper. Is like, how do they view their actions within a rubric of deterrence, and that's very different from our understanding of deterrence. So things that they would do to us might not be the most logical action, but to them it's very logical. It's very part of this kind of systematic approach. So just translating their theory, understanding what actions might be part of that theory is important. Even if we will respond in kind, at least we understand that what they're doing and why they're doing it has some kind of logic and purpose to it.
Would it be useful to have, like, maybe, simulations, tabletop exercises with the Chinese so that they could actually see how the Americans think about a specific crisis? And then maybe they would come to understand better how we see crisis escalation dynamics and crisis avoidance. And um, when I was at CSIS years ago, I did some trilateral tabletop simulations with the Chinese and the Philippines in the US, and one with the Chinese and Japan in the United States. And I found that to be fascinating to just experience how the different sides really thought about crisis. But my sense is this doesn't really take place very much, if at all. It's become much more difficult to have these kinds of interactions with China. But maybe somebody could convince the Chinese that this would be a useful thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a part of several dialogues, as you have too, about security and national security exercises, and China's closing off the channels. Even academics are not seem to be willing to engage in a constructive, honest conversation about what they would do. So it's unfortunate, but I honestly think the more that we can write about it in the open sources and share that with our Chinese counterparts about the things that concern us and the things that we might do is very important. Even if they don't respond, or they say, that's highly provocative, it still gets up into their system and kind of gets absorbed as far as things that we view China would do that might be escalatory. I will say that we've had this dialogue with the Chinese through the Pacific Forum on nuclear issues, and that's been constructive because we in the U.S. side share a lot of concerns about specific contingencies where nuclear weapons might be used, and the Chinese usually don't reciprocate for as far as giving specific examples, but we do, and so we share that with them in our concerns. And I think it does get through to them, even if they don't respond in an honest and kind of constructive way. But yeah, absolutely. I think the more dialogues we have, the better. That's why it's unfortunate that China seems to be much more closed as far as its willingness to meet with us. But I know in DoD, seems like these dialogues are continuing under the Trump administration, so that's a good thing.
All right. Well, maybe one last question about Taiwan. Does your analysis help us to predict which Taiwan contingencies are most likely? People talk about a blockade or seizing one of the outer islands, maybe Jinmun or Madzu, or the island that Taiwan occupies, in the South China Sea, or Penghu. There's a lot of different scenarios. Or some people say just a full scale invasion that, of course, uses missiles and cyber, create a advantageous situation for the PLA to actually establish a beachhead, and then followed by an invasion. I'm just curious if you have a sense as to what you think is most likely what the PLA would do based on your study of how they think about use of force.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned Taiwan, and I think Taiwan and the South China Sea are two good examples where we see this effective control concept being uh, showed on a daily basis as far as the peacetime part of shaping the narrative about China's actions. They're very clear about why they're doing things for Taiwan. It's clearly now it's about the president of Taiwan, Lai Ching-te, being the source of all the tension. So they're very good at blaming him and smearing him for doing what they see as actions that are contributing to tension in the region. Same thing with the Philippines, blaming the Philippines for pushing China's bottom line, and the second Thomas Shoal see this a lot. So this narrative is going on daily, and so I would place that in this effectively shaping the situation framework, this first stage. Um, and then once it gets into the second stage of kind of managing it, I think where when China does a drill over Taiwan, that's probably an example of that, where they're doing an action that they think is responding to threats to their sovereignty, um, and they're very good at signaling why they're doing it. So this most recent exercise um, last week was very clearly tailored towards the Taiwanese people and Lai Ching-te himself. But they seem to be signaling that they're doing it in a way. Well, I mean, the drills were only 2 days, so it was very kind of short in scope and scale. It was a large scale exercise, but just the amount of time they did was short. So I see that as kind of very calibrated in a way that's they don't want to let it kind of veer out of control into a possible unintended crisis with Taiwan, with the U.S. But they're doing so in ways that's very clearly showing the resolve and the purpose of why they're doing it. So to the Chinese, it's very clear about why they're doing it and explaining it. I don't know if it's clear as much in the international community. I mean, with Taiwan, I think it's clear about why the PLA is doing this. But some say, is this a rehearsal or prelude for an invasion? I think from what I can see, it's very different from that. I mean, China would send much different signals as far as indicators and warnings about invasion versus just a training exercise. So I think it's very important to be very cognizant of the nuance of their signaling, um, the type of training they do, not overreact, but at the same time be vigilant and kind of responding and watching what they're doing. But from a Chinese perspective, I think they've been very successful at kind of managing the narrative, pushing back on what they see as Philippines and Taiwanese, uh, challenges to the interests, and in doing so in a way that doesn't kind of become a crisis where they lose control of it.
We've been talking with Lyle Morris. He's a senior fellow on foreign policy and national security at the Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Thanks again for joining us, Lyle.
Thanks, Bonnie.